ask you what your relationship is to The Office and problematic or not. Your
Relationship.
view, Jake. What's your
Yeah.
relationship with The Office? Problematic.
Whew. My relationship with it.
What's your
Yeah.
relationship with The Office?
My relationship with it.
What's your
Yeah.
relationship with The Office?
Wait, so let's dial back. I don't understand. You want to know
Like
like,
an
Okay.
intense question.
All right. So, Jake, what is your relationship with The Office and problematic?
Okay, so I started The Office to me is the first television show that I've watched from like when it came on TV. I started watching it at the first episode and I watched it all the way through. And that was the first show. I was a young teenager. I mean, does anyone know off the top of their head when it came out? Like 2000.
2003, 2004.
Yeah. So I mean, I was like 11 or 12, maybe 13 at max. But I just started watching it on NBC because they had like a pretty decent
Wow.
comedy lineup. Actually, it was like 30 Rock and The Office. And so I started watching that, and I saw all the way through and kind of aged along with it, and I loved it. I thought it was amazing. Thought it was one of the funniest shows ever. It obviously went to Netflix, and I kind of did the whole Netflix binge of it. But yeah, I would say I haven't watched it. Well, my roommate watched it all the way through again pretty recently. So I caught it fairly recently, but I haven't actually sat down and watched it super recently just on my own too much anymore. But I would say I've seen it at least probably 3 to 4 times through solidly. And whether or not I find it problematic, that's a tough question, and I'm excited to hear what we say on it. I'm going to say no. But Michael Scott is not somebody that people should like, and I think that like it kind of had the Fight Club Joker, Rick and Morty complex where people latched onto him in the wrong way. So I think it's ultimately kind of problematic, but I don't know. I love it, so we'll see.
So, Miranda, what is your relationship to The Office and problematic?
The first time I ever seen The Office was back when it was on TV. I don't like remember the exact episode, but my mom would watch it, and I just remember thinking, this is the freaking funniest show I've ever seen. And then I really didn't start binge watching it until it came on Netflix, and I have no idea how many times I've seen it all the way through, because it's definitely been a lot, and it's gotten me through some pretty hard times, like moving to college and being all by myself. And I would say I'm going to go with problematic, because I think it's definitely easier to argue that it's problematic rather than it's not.
So, Sabrina, what is your relationship with The Office and problematic?
Okay, so we don't really have an intimate relationship like Miranda and Jake, but we're pretty much just like acquaintances, friends. I was first introduced, I guess. I mean, I've heard a lot about it, but I never watched it until like 4 months ago when I was in California. My friend's boyfriend said it was funny, and I kind of watched it then, so I decided to start watching it on my own. And I'm on like season 5 now, so obviously I've been watching it recently, and I don't think it's problematic.
Stephanie, what is your relationship with The Office and problematic?
My relationship with The Office is I was introduced to it, I think, by Jamie, I'm going to say. I don't really remember before that. I watched it with Jamie all the way through. We've seen it all the way through a lot, multiple times. Sometimes we just watch it in the middle. I've seen it a lot. I have seen all of it. When I first started thinking about this, was going to say, yes, it is problematic, but I might be having a change of heart in the sense that if it's purely satire, then it's not problematic, and it's very useful to pointing out things that are wrong. So I'm going to say a 50-50.
So, my relationship with The Office, the first time I watched it, I was really high on K2. I had put off watching it because I don't watch things that are popular because I'm annoyingly punk
Pretentious.
and sure, that's a word we can use. But I was really freaked out. I was like really high on K2 and I needed something to just fucking bring me down. And it did it. And the first episode I watched was the Christmas episode, and it's still one of my favorite jokes. But Dwight, it's something like there are many ways to kill a zombie, but the most satisfying is to stab it in the head with a stick or something like that. And that like brought me back to earth. That's my relationship with it. It like grounded me, and maybe rationally or not, I've kind of had that emotional weight to it. It's always been kind of a crutch for me. I don't know. I think Trailer Park Boys has the same appeal, but it's just passive. It can just be white noise because it doesn't matter. And so I think that nothingness of the show makes us passively watch it so much that we miss what I believe are really dangerous and problematic elements that actually drive what it is we like about the show.
Yeah, so I think just to like maybe jump off a point that both you and Stephanie made, is like it's maybe important to talk about. I mean, so this show is certainly satire. I think that we can all agree with that. They're not writing Michael Scott in a way that we're supposed to laugh at his racism and say, "Oh, that racist thing he said was funny." We're supposed to react to someone in control with power saying something this fucked up to one of their employees, and that's the funny thing. But then the question that you have to really start to like ask yourself is, does this show maintain its popularity because it's a great satire that points this shit out, or is it because people like to laugh at racist stuff and it's just funny to them, and they think Michael Scott is funny and not bad? And of course, like even consciously, I'm sure they can say, "Oh, he's supposed to be a terrible person," but like subconsciously, I guess the question is like, what is funny about The Office? Is it the satire and like what it's pointing out, and kind of the like exaggerated purpose that it does it, or like do we just laugh at it because it is cringy and awkward and brutal, but also, I mean, I think that a lot of the things we laugh at might not be for great reasons. I don't know. I guess that's just maybe my question. And like anyone else can.
That's a good point to make, because I think I don't have the same affinity that I used to, but the South Park is kind of that same kind of humor where there are kind of two different crowds, at least from it's pretentious perspective, but like you either get what the joke is with the meaningful context, or maybe you're racist and homophobic redneck, Right. But the same way I think that's important to point out about The Office is, especially in the earlier episodes, and if I could actually throw more of my pretentiousness into this, a lot of my perspective is coming from watching the original Office, the British version, and understanding the dynamic. Like you see the tone change from the first season to the rest. Like after The Office got picked up in America, they changed the tone radically because the humor that's injected in the British version just doesn't work in America, because we don't really like to be challenged in that way. Because David Brent in the original, he's the Michael Scott character in the British version. Like he has all of those attributes of Michael. Like he is an asshole, insensitive, homophobic, xenophobic, even if not xenophobic or racist, but like problematic or racially biased. But they lean into it. Like it's like the joke in the British version is how absurd and cruel David Brent is. And what they do with Michael Scott is like, oh, he's quirky and, kind of Homer Simpson-ish. And so I think you're right in pointing that out. But even when it's appropriate to laugh at Michael Scott, I think it's only it's only happening because they intentionally designed his character to be different than David Brent.
I had a boss who was inappropriate and made homophobic jokes, made jokes about drug addicts, didn't understand how to speak to women, like called us babe and sweetheart, and always wanted to like touch us.
I've had ignorant bosses, and I think I've had bosses where, you know, the collective agreement between everyone, all of my, you know, coworkers are just, we are smarter than that person, you know.
Yes.
Like, and so that is relatable, at least. I don't think I've had anyone that, well, I'll take that back to one degree. I've had one very real Michael Scott office where just in front, you know, it was a big staff meeting, and the head guy that owned all the restaurants, like our corporate manager, came in and just said some racist ass shit, and all of us just were like, what the fuck? And so, I mean, I guess I've had those moments where it makes it clear that, like, Michael Scott, while exaggerated, does exist. And that's another reason of, like, is it okay to be laughing at this? Because in all reality, like, this shit is out there. It is an extreme version, but not in all cases, you know? And it's like, it's easy to laugh at if it's not happening to you, but if your boss is saying that kind of shit to you, it's not really funny. So
I think that's important to. So I'll call this Exhibit A. So it's. I'm going to go to a quote from Pam, but I do want to preface it with the point you're making, Jake, in that asking that question: is it appropriate for us to be laughing along with these obvious truisms about what inspired the character Michael Scott? And maybe I'm, you know, being pretentious and imposing my own politic to it, but I think that to have an appropriate relationship with someone exploiting you, you have to feel the pain. It's like it's a trope about the worst slave master was the one who kept his slaves happy. You know what I mean? Like keeping your slaves well fed and giving them a nice bed to sleep on. Like, they're still slaves, but if you justify their existence through, you know, creature comforts, then you know, what is the value in that? I'm going to read a quote. It's the very last dialogue in the entire series. So Sabrina, forgive me. Huge spoiler. So just to contextualize it for Sabrina, you're probably aware that it's a documentary they've been filming the whole time, and the last couple episodes is about them premiering it, and they go to these parties, and they're just kind of wrapping up the show. And this is Pam talking about the documentary to the documentary crew about watching the documentary. Very meta, but it says, it would be great if people saw this documentary and learned from my mistakes. Not that I'm a tragic person. I'm really happy now, but it would just make my heart sore if someone out there saw this and said to herself, be strong, trust yourself, love yourself, conquer your fears, just go after what you want and act fast, because life just isn't that long. I'm going to really break this apart, but so, like, the implication of this is that somehow she had a journey worth investigating. And I've had this conversation with Stephanie before, like, from a feminist perspective. The third season starts out with what could be a really great trajectory for a character like Pam, but it really just imposes the patriarchic view of gender roles. I think the gestation of her and Jim's relationship is toxic. It's not saying that her relationship with Roy was not, but they're both. I think the relationship with Jim started with a lot of non-consensual interactions that subsequently destroyed the relationship with Roy. But she was in a place in the beginning of the third season where she was alone, and how she dealt with that actually defined an entire trajectory throughout the entire season, where I think identify with Pam as some kind of like strong, independent feminist figure.
I think it's a good reason. To that point, like I think that it's easy to look at the show and say, "Oh, it's problematic because Michael Scott says so many just blatantly terrible things." But I think that's another. The whole Jim and Pam relationship, I think, is a really interesting thing that kind of even still, and that's one of the most lasting kind of cultural holds that I think it has. I'm assuming that Jamie, you and Stephanie are probably a little bit too old and in a committed monogamous relationship to be on Tinder. But if you guys were on Tinder, and so Sabrina and Miranda, I don't know, maybe you guys can just attest to it a little bit more. But like, it's insane. One, I would say one of the most common things in anyone's fucking bio is a reference to The Office. And two, it's like looking for the Pam to my Jim, looking for the Jim to my Pam, like crazy. And it's like, that's not a good like that's what you think is the most romantic relationship of our fucking time.
I think we can have a really interesting conversation about this. So I'm going to ask each of you, give me your impression of what you think about the relationship between Jim and Pam. We'll start with Sabrina.
Okay, so I think, like, I guess it 100% depends on who is watching the show. Because all of us, I think we can agree, like, we understand it's just facetious humor, haha, we're laughing, like, I mean, we're like, oh, like, this is serious, like, this happens, and it's funny because it does happen, but we know we do not submit to that culture, hopefully, like, we don't want to be in a relationship like that. I think the relationship is, like, okay on a surface level because, like, they're helping each other get through the mundane day that's awful, and they, like, lean on each other for support in that way. But I understand how it can be problematic because, as you said, like, it started out, like, bad and just, like, she is submissive to Michael and Jim and every man in the office. So, yeah, I would say it depends on what, like, you're talking about and who is watching the show as they're looking at this relationship. And I believe some people on Tinder might be just, like, joking. They may understand, like, the humor. Like, it's just a joke because we watch The Office and it's, like, haha, funny. We're not, like, looking at, I don't know, a deep level. Like, I don't think they're like, oh, my God, like, this is the best relationship I've ever seen in my whole life. I hope that I find this. It's more of just, like, a joke. Like, oh, I hope to find Jim my Pam. Or, like, any other stupid joke you can make. Like, Mario and Luigi. Like, I mean, just, like, SpongeBob and Patrick. You know, just, like, hope I find my Patrick. So, but, I mean, some people might look at it like, that's a good relationship. So, yeah, that's my take.
One of the things I was going to bring up is, like, romanticizing the idea of workplace relationships. And, like, maybe you guys can, like, touch on that, like, a little bit better than I can. But I don't like that. Like, I don't like how, like, Andy and Jim, Pam, so many of them are, like, and Aaron too, like, are just, like, all looking, like, in the office for, like, their significant other. And I think that can make, like, regular working conditions kind of weird when you think about people, like, sexualizing you at work. But I don't know. It's unhealthy, I think.
And just, like, the joke, like, don't meet your honey where you make your money. Like, I've heard, like, older people say that. So that's just, like, funny. And I agree with that. But then Jamie and I mean, we've talked about it before, how, like, we spend most of our time at work. So, like, where else am I supposed to meet people? Mm-hmm. And I think that's another joke kind of built into the thing, because they do spend most of their time at work, as you can see. And then you hang out with the same people you work with because they're the only friends you have. So
I also did sleep with someone I worked with, so
I think I'm a hypocrite, so I'm just kidding.
Well, I think it's a good point to make about sort of like to infuse the politic to it. I obviously have a perceived criticism of the nature of work in our current system. Like Sabrina was saying, we do spend all of this time in our offices, so to speak. I just think it's it's obvious that any relationship you cultivate inside of a relationship that's submissive in nature, like you're obedient to your job. It's like innate to the relationship between you and your employer. They have the upper hand in most every employment relationship. And so when you're finding any kind of intimate relationship inside of that, like it's all going to be subjugate to that. Because when you think about it, like any relationship you have at the workplace is subjugate to the boss and authority and administration at that particular workplace. Like when you think about some of the reference to relationships in the office, like they have to file like the HR reports or whatever.
They're just kind of keeping each other entertained. And to me, it kind of seems like their relationship is based out of like boredom and passivity. Because, like, I saw Pam as, like you said, she could have gone on to be this independent woman. She could have gone to art school and graphic design school and stayed there and had a more fulfilling life. Like, she probably would have had to quit her job to do that. But she could have, her life could have been led through pursuits and passions, not just, like, based on needing to be in a relationship.
My problems with it are a little bit different. Because I think that in a lot of ways, the start of their relationship, I don't necessarily have a huge problem with, in the sense of, I guess, them being in a workplace relationship, because I think we see a lot of the other inappropriate kind of sexual misbehavior in the workplace kind of dealt with in other ways. I don't really feel like there's an unfair power dynamic between Jim and Pam necessarily, but the reason that I find it problematic, and Sabrina, I'm sorry if this is some spoilers, but when Jim takes that new job and doesn't tell Pam, like, that's just, Jim was my favorite character until like a few years back, that I think it was like a BuzzFeed article came out that was like a pretty detailed piece on why Jim was a piece of trash. And you can't really fight it too much. You can't. Like, they lay out all these reasons so well, and it's just like, oh man, even though he's probably the most likable person in the show, he's still kind of a piece of shit man. And so, and then doubly with that, we're able to see how Roy turns his life around and kind of is really great. So that's a whole nother question of, like, did he even do anything good? But, like, we think, oh, he took her away from this violent, like, crummy man, but, like, was he really like that, though? I don't really see it starting off as too problematic. I mean, he does steal her from a fiance, which that's got its own, like, merits of problems, but really, it's like their evolution as a couple, I think, is very unhealthy. And, like, if the show really would have cared about telling an interesting story, they would have broken up, because that's what they were building up to, and that's what would have made more sense. And that actually would have been a story that, wow, I mean, isn't that crazy that, like, we watched this crazy love story and then it all just falls apart last minute, such as real life often does. I mean,
so I'm going to speak to that directly. The assumption is that the relationship started off relatively innocent, but I'm going to object that it didn't. Pam was very clear that she wasn't willing to make the decision to become intimate with Jim because she valued their relationship in a different way than he did. I'm open to the ambiguities of the kinds of relationships you build with people. Like, there's a lot of nuance to it. I do believe that she was sexually attracted or whatnot. Like, I don't think he, like, raped her or sexually assaulted her, but she had made a decision about the morality in which she was trying to live her life. And so the first and second kiss were not consensual. I would challenge you to go look back again. They were not consensual. She didn't invite the kiss. There wasn't discussion about it happening. Pretend you're watching it from a guidance counselor perspective, and it's like, it's this confused woman having her best friend say, I want to completely rattle your life and shake it apart and reassemble it in ways you've never imagined.
I think that he did cross a, like, clear boundary. Like, there was 100% a clear boundary that, without any exception, like, everyone can admit, like, regardless of what the tension that there was and stuff, she didn't want to, like, she specifically said, I want to be loyal to Roy, and, like, even though there might be attraction, like, I don't want this to happen. And those first two kisses weren't consensual.
She
Yeah.
said, I can't. It's very
Well,
firm.
every great love story starts with an I can't.
Or a no. You know.
And-
Wow.
I think breaking up the relationship between Pam and Roy, that's the least problematic. Relationships are built on routine, habit, action. You can see it. It's obvious Roy and Pam's relationship was shit because Pam eventually left, even though Pam or Jim left town. The point Jake was making about how you raised the point about Jim being shit, but a lot of people like his character. You know, Jim is this pretty commonly popular character in the series. I think the most, and I'm just going to pose this and let me know what y'all think. I think the most moral character, like if we're talking about the best character with moral consistency, is Dwight. And I think it's interesting how he's demonized most of the series. Really think about Dwight is a matter-of-fact, morally consistent person who is consistent to the ideals that like Americans like claim they have and the way you're supposed to address work, but the way in which he does it, which would make your life more productive and meaningful if you're going to just submit to this work-based system, and then he gets nothing but shit for it.
I would just like to counter that real fast that Kevin has done nothing wrong, ever. He's the only character that has never done anything wrong.
I would
Kevin
argue
is good.
maybe Kevin Malone is like the maybe he's like the anarchist punk of The Office.
He dropped
I don't know.
early, so he did do something wrong.
But he didn't mean to. That was an accident.
It depends what kind of porn he was watching. You know what I mean? Because he's frequently needed. He's always watching. You know, I gotta clear my computer.
Damn.
I'd really need to know what the content of that is before we could move on, and not to be, a prude, but I mean the way it's always implied, it's like, I don't know. There's always this illusion to me. I've always thought, like, is it child porn? Like, what the fuck? But I don't know. That's just
It was all very sensual with good lighting. It was fine. Okay, we're getting off topic. We're now talking about what,
So Dwight, I think he's the most moral character in the show. And what do you all think about how he's demonized?
I think he is a like good moral character, and he is consistent throughout the entire show. And I think the reason people look down upon him is because he's like a pussy, and he just doesn't stand up, and he's just not funny, and he's like that boring guy that's just in the office, and we don't want to be that guy. We want to be like Jim, who's hot, and he gets girls, and he's funny, and everyone likes him. But like Dwight, everyone hates him pretty much.
Well, I don't like Dwight because he's a cop, but he is the most he is the most loyal. He, I would say, has the biggest moral compass. I mean, his downfall is being completely socially inept, but like who in that show really has good social skills? I don't know. I think that's probably a case that can be argued pretty well, because also I cannot think of a lot of times where Dwight does anything intentionally bad. He's probably ignorant, but even on a lesser scale than Michael is. So, I think that if there is a like moral compass to the show, it probably would be Dwight.
I think it's interesting you make the. I mean, I would agree. He literally is a cop, volunteer at least. But what I think is interesting is how people, the way in which we romanticize this show. We've talked about how it normalizes destructive behavior of bosses like Michael Scott, and everyone knows that he's a shitty boss. But the way in which they write and Steve Carell performs the character, it really does create this endearing personality around it, and then it helps you look at bosses the other way. I mean, I think that's what art or like media does, is like helps you relate and contextualize these experiences to yourself. I think human beings do this. We talked about Jim and Pam's relationship. I believe that it started without consent. That consent led into a toxicity that Like Jake touched on. It like led into their marriage even after they had 2 kids together and got married.
And this is the question I think we've kind of been struggling with of like, is it interpretation versus intent? And is like, are we supposed to look at this as kind of a tragic story of like how so many relationships really are kind of so relying on each other and like honestly, but that's still who we want to be because nobody wants to be the cool guy or the boring guy.
Dwight.
But, like, that's the good character, right? Nobody wants to be Dwight, but that's who we should be. And like, was that the takeaway that maybe everyone missed? And is the show not problematic? Is it just that we're all too fucking dumb and like blinded by the fact of like you said, Jim's hot and cool and funny?
If we're talking boring people with a moral compass and consistency, we should be talking about Toby.
That's
Wow.
what,
Actually,
wait, that's what I
Miranda
was going to say.
just shattered it through
No.
Toby. Yep. No.
But he keeps coming on to Pam, and Pam made it clear
Dwight
Good.
and
True.
Angela were like,
multiple times.
they had like a whole contract thing going on.
Yeah, actually, Dwight he was kind of shitty towards Angela at a couple points too, though. I think everyone's just awful. This is a terrible, problematic show, right? Is that the conclusion?
Here's where I think the redeeming value of the show is. I believe it's the 7th season. The entire Robert California arc. I think Robert California comes in and makes all of these critiques about these characters that we're making right now. Like the critique of like the inconsistency of the morality and perspective that all of this plot and storyline is supposed to have been cultivating the whole time. When Robert California comes in, I think he challenges the viewer in a way that the show hadn't done. And it's interesting to me. I'm curious how the character came about because he starts having the viewer think about things in a complex way.
Oh, I'm in the same boat. I love Robert California. I mean, The Office definitely changed in 6 or 7, whenever, no spoilers, but the show definitely changes and it becomes something completely different. Robert California to me is one of like the highlights of the later seasons though, especially because I think just in general, the show kind of started to lose, they just started to change their characters in a way that I didn't feel was consistent with the show. I think Robert California is a good addition because it's a little bit more forceful, I think, about the complexities of what the show is trying to say. I think that's the writers kind of just saying, okay, if you fucking missed it, here's what we're trying to say. This is what it's about. And it comes through kind of a strange character because I think he is kind of difficult to like. But, I think the irony is like, it's so funny how easy it is to like, we've just sat here and kind of pointed all these criticisms out about Jim, Pam, Michael, but we like them all a lot. And I think it's a little bit more difficult to like Robert California, but I do think he is he gives a lot more to the show than most of the other characters do, at least in a shorter time frame, because he's only around like a season or 2.
I mean, I think what you said, Jake, about the writers using him as an opportunity to like reinforce whatever their objective was in the first place. Like, I wonder if they were conscious about like, because like in a show like this, once it becomes the machine it is, like you can't stop it. It's not your choice. Right. Like if they were conscious of like, wow, this is a shitstorm and it should have stopped 2 years ago. Because obviously Steve Carell had that thought, like, I'm done. This is over. Jump the shark. Is The Office problematic and should it be canceled?
I think it's a super nuanced show. I think that it served its place. I think it's really telling and strange that it's still so popular. And so with that, I'm going to say, ultimately, I find it problematic, and yes, it should be canceled. I think maybe if you do like one viewing on it, just to get it, if you've never seen it, watch it once. But like, don't let this become your security blanket like it did for. And it sounds like all of us. I mean, like all of us had it be a security blanket at one point. But like, don't, because there's a lot better media to consume out there. Even if you want comedy, So I think, yeah, in this day and age, we don't need office marathons anymore. It doesn't need to be the #1 show on Netflix. Ultimately, I think that the points were lost on most of us, even myself included in a lot of ways when I was younger. So I think, yeah, it is ultimately problematic and should be canceled. I feel like the fucking PC police
I know.
canceling everything, but I don't know. I just think we can do better, and so why not do better?
Miranda, canceled?
I'm gonna stick with my original answer and say yes, I think The Office is problematic. And I used it as a security blanket for a long time, but it's probably time for it to be canceled. I'm tired of scrolling through Tinder and seeing everybody's like just looking for my
I'm
ham.
saying.
Sabrina,
After
While
the
you're still in-
conversation, I haven't
While you're-
finished.
Yeah,
You
you got
haven't finished, so-
Yeah, shit.
So that
So-
will probably everything will make more sense once I finish, and I'll have a better answer, and I will
That's
let you
fair.
guys know how I feel.
So where we're at now, canceled?
I think I agree with Jake that you should be allowed to watch it once, and you should not be able to reference it as much as people do. You only get like 2 Office references like a year or something. I don't know, maybe that's a little too extreme, but
Stephanie, canceled?
As much as I for some reason I don't want to cancel it. It's probably the security blanket thing and hearing the conversations about Robert California. I thought he was really mean, but now I'm understanding that he was just like voicing critiques out loud. So that's interesting. So yes, problematic, and yes, you can watch it once as a anthropologist.
Right.
Again, I do think it's problematic. I think the themes and the romanticization make it a really destructive experience Americans have had. But I don't know. I don't know if you cancel it or not. Again, like I said, there's still something. It really did. It took me back to earth after being fucked up on K2. So there's like this emotional connection to it that.
Yeah.
I think there is an experience we've all had with it that there's obviously something real and deep and true about the nature of the show, the intention of the writing, what it has to say. I think it is a cultural moment. So I think it's interesting. Everyone said everyone should watch it once because it's such a cultural phenomenon that like you have to know what The Office is or you're not going to be able to be like
in society.
As sensational as it sounds, like if you don't know The Office, you're marginalizing yourself, and that's a very white privileged thing to say, but I think it's absolutely true. I think if you are marginalizing yourself with the absence of The Office in your life, it's not like you're missing out on some like good art or whatever, but it's like I'm hesitant to cancel it because I think that if you cancel The Office, then all that's left is Friends, and I think that's way shittier than The Office. And the multiplying.
Da-na-na, da-na-na-na-na-na-na, da-na-na-na-na-na.
On the next problematic.
I saw Tiger